Hello, thank you everyone for coming to another Disability Futurity seminar. I'm Ryan Patterson, Project Director of the series with the Carleton University Disability Research Group in collaboration with Professor David Bolt at the Liverpool Hope University Center for Culture and Disability Studies. We're fortunate to have with us today two excellent scholars of, among other things, disability studies, feminist science, and crip theory. Dr. Kelly Fritsch, Assistant Professor with the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Carleton University, and Dr. Anne Maguire, Associate Professor with the Program for Critical Studies in Equity and Solidarity at the University of Toronto. They're going to explore the ways that disability has been and still is conceived, categorized, and ranked along a spectrum of genetic risk, and the implications of such risk-based views for disability justice and for disability futurity. And since most of you are muted, please join me now and at the end visually in welcoming our speakers. And Kelly and Anne, I turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you, Ryan. So I'm just gonna share our PowerPoint. And I'm going to turn off my video because I'm in competition with lots of other people in my house. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks for having us here today as part of the Disability Futurity Seminar series. We've been keen viewers of this ongoing lecture series on the Liverpool Hope University Center for Culture and Disability Studies YouTube channel, and are pleased to be able to present our work in this transnational venue. Thanks in particular to Ryan Patterson for all his work, and to our tech support today for ensuring that we could be here with you. The work we are presenting builds on a paper published last summer in the journal Body and Society, which serves as a case study we are reworking within our current book project, tentatively titled A Broken Politics for a Disabled World. This project explores how spectrums or gradations of risk have become culturally sedimented ways by which we come to know, experience, and problem solve about disability. The spectral, we contend, is deeply influencing our shared cultural understandings about the broken, the disabled, the debilitated, and those deemed at risk or in danger of becoming disabled or debilitated. Our book project is thus in one part about how these gradations of risk become sedimented discourses and the implications of this on the category of disability and on disability as a way of being. But also, secondly, it is a project that explores how crip culture or crip social relations respond to this spectralization through repair and maintenance practices. In contrast to more individualized responses to disability that hail risk as an individual problem requiring therapeutic response or else eugenic eradication, we argue that practices of repair and maintenance compel a deeper engagement with how risk is shared, negotiated, and differentiated. We thus take up the ways in which we are collectively disabled by degree, from our bodies to our climate to our futures, to open up discussion about how notions of degree, spectrum, gradation at once constrain, but also open up possibility for more collectively just futures that include carceral abolition, anti-capitalism, anti-colonialism, and anti-racism, as central tenets of the world we want to build. We will begin by reviewing our case study and then turn our attention to explore how this case fits within our larger book project. We will end with some questions that remain for us as a way of opening up discussion.
Okay, so turning now to the case study. In April 2016, the New York Times reported the story of Angela Collins and her partner, Elizabeth Hansen, who had conceived their son with the help of Zytex Corporation, which is a sperm bank in Atlanta, Georgia. And there's some news headlines on the screen. They chose donor 9623, who they now know to be Chris Ageles, and a apparently healthy, middle-class white man, described by Zytex as among their best donors. According to his profile, donor 9623 had an IQ of 160, spoke 4 languages, was a talented drummer. He held a master's degree in artificial intelligence and was working toward a PhD in neuroscience engineering. About 7 years after the birth of their son, following an accidental confidentiality breach by Zytex, Hansen and Collins learned that the sperm bank and donor 9623 had omitted certain information from his profile, including facts about his appearance, his background, and medical history. Ageles had dropped out of college, had struggled to hold down jobs, and had a record of arrest. Hansen and Collins also determined that Ageles had been hospitalized, receiving psychiatric diagnoses of bipolar and narcissistic personality disorders, in addition to schizophrenia. Upon uncovering this information, Hansen and Collins filed a lawsuit against the sperm bank and the donor, alleging fraud, negligent misrepresentation, breach of warranty, and unfair business practice. While the parents reported to the media that their son is, quote unquote, happy and healthy, does well in school, and is, quote, musically gifted, unquote, Collins continued to worry that he is, quote, potentially facing a very debilitating lifestyle, unquote. In a 2016 interview with the CBC, Collins shared that she had told her son that the man who helped create him had, as she terms it, quote, something wrong with his brain, unquote, leading her son to ask, am I okay? You're fine right now, Collins said in response. Still, despite their son being fine right now, Hansen and Collins nonetheless sought damages, as well as a medical monitoring fund for the donor-conceived child in light of his increased genetic risk. The fund would cover the cost of ongoing evaluation for early signs of mental illness, as well as preventative or future psychiatric treatment. In the same interview, Collins stated, quote, we know nobody is perfect, but we didn't sign up to choose knowingly that our donor had schizophrenia, end quote. Collins and Hansen's statement that they would not have knowingly used a donor with a history of mental illness most clearly conjures up eugenic notions of risky genetics that continue to inflect contemporary understandings of embodied difference, marking social inequalities as being produced by underlying genetic biological abnormalities that can be medicalized, monitored, and proactively guarded against. In this presentation, we follow this legacy of eugenics from the institutional creation of the sperm bank through to the contemporary case of donor 9623. Such a tracing allows us to attend to the ways in which contemporary discourses of medicalization have shifted from a focus on ostensibly clear-cut categories of genetic pathology to individualized spectrums of susceptibility that entrench risk at all levels of life. Being, quote, fine right now marks the fate of Collins and Hansen's son as not fully biologically determined, but rather as at risk of disability, as at risk of disability. These perspectives echo studies in psychology and neurogenetics, which have for decades shown that differences like schizophrenia are co-constituted by our biology and by our social, cultural, and economic environments. Our phenotypic expression is shaped not only by our biology, but by our relations and our conditions of living, including generational histories, environmental exposures, and or personal experiences of trauma and oppression. This evidence offers feminists and disability scholars and activists a robust opening through which we can push for the creation of more equitable structures, institutions, and relations, environments that can support more just ways of living with and across differences of the body and mind.
According to the Oxford English Dictionary, spectrum as a noun refers to an apparition or phantom, as well as the entire range or extent of something arranged by degree, quality. Spectre similarly refers to an apparition, phantom, or ghost, especially one of a terrifying nature, while also referring to an object or source of dread or terror. The etymology of spectrum and specter both derive from Latin, meaning to look or see. The specter as an object of dread might be understood as a kind of frame or lens through which we see or experience the world. Gleaned through the discourse of risk, disability as a graded range of potential intensities or severities becomes a ghost that is haunting embodiment, one that must be continually guarded against. The spectralization of disability, or the idea that disability is not a singular ontological trait or category of being, but is rather a graded, tenuous, and flexible state of becoming, is not limited to the realm of genetics. Ideas about continuums of disability, non-disability, and or graded scales of normalcy, abnormalcy reverberate at the cultural level, both producing and constraining particular understandings of embodied risk. For example, everyday observations like, aren't we all a little autistic? Or she's got a touch of OCD, or there's no such thing as normal, circulate ubiquitously through contemporary Western culture. We also find traces of the spectral within our own home of disability studies and activism. Here, the non-normative body-mind is politicized precisely through the understanding that disability is an always changing relation between body and environment. Notions like temporarily able-bodied or misfit, and concepts like chronicity, neurodiversity, or capacity and debility mark disability not as a concrete thing that inheres within an individual biological body or mind, but rather as a relation, a biosocial gradation of difference. Such conceptual frameworks, which name ability as fluid, plastic, changing, context-dependent, historically arising, contingent, forever shifting the terrain between normal and abnormal, importantly provide the means for marking out the differential and often unjust structural conditions under which disability is produced. They also importantly enable generative explorations of the difference that naming disability can make, thereby opening up new possibilities for what it could mean to welcome rather than repudiate disability within our communities. Our work thus seeks to better understand how concepts and categories of disability are being reorganized as risk is mapped onto a spectrum. Whether emanating from the realm of biomedical diagnosis, popular culture, critical scholarship, or activism, the trouble with the spectral lies in the ways in which it upholds disability, or a more severe or intense form of disability, as an object of dread. Through the case of donor 9623, we show how the relational possibility of disability risk is obscured as risk becomes individualized, treatment customizable, and surveillance perpetual. Too often, notions of spectral risk haunted by disability dread fail to substantively alter material or social structural inequities toward disability justice. So we advocate for a critical engagement with the spectralization of risk and disability as it relates to disability politics and to the study of disability, health, and embodiment more generally.
The case of donor 9623 turns on eugenic understandings of risky biological inheritances. Collins and Hansen's lawsuit against Zytex alleges that the corporation sold the plaintiffs a, quote, defective and unsafe sperm product, a product it is assumed that plays a key role in determining the future outlook and life chances of the biological offspring it helped to create. In an interview with the Toronto Star, Collins states this. She says, "The concerns we have about our son's future are related directly to the donor's genetics. He has some serious debilitating mental health issues that, if our son was to develop those into puberty and into early adulthood, he might end up having a life not unlike our donor. It took him, the donor, 20 years to get his bachelor's. He struggled keeping a job, was in and out of jail, in and out of psych wards. This isn't exactly what we had signed up for," end quote. Biology anticipates the future, alleges Collins. Thus, a core assumption at the heart of the case against Xytex is that donors with traits or characteristics that are deemed undesirable cannot possibly produce safe or reproductive grade sperm, and that this is true whether the donor traits or characteristics in question are understood to be genetically heritable or not. The answer to the question of whether a donor with undesirable traits is fit to reproduce is a resounding no, and one that it would seem has been agreed upon by everyone in advance. Indeed, the rise of assisted reproduction, which includes the contemporary phenomenon of the for-profit sperm bank, is inseparable from a eugenic history focused on human improvement and social betterment. The first use of donor sperm in the US is thought to have occurred in the late 19th century at the hands of Philadelphia physician Dr. William Pancoast, who, after confirming infertility in one of his male patients, chloroformed and artificially inseminated the man's unwitting wife with sperm donated reportedly by the, quote, best looking member of his medical class. As artificial insemination with donor sperm became more common in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, careful attention was paid to finding donors who either matched or, quote unquote, exceeded the recipient family's race, class, temperament, and accomplishments. In the midst of the formal eugenic movement in North America and in Europe, artificial insemination offered doctors and patients a means of scientifically selecting for traits deemed superior. Tensions between reproductive normalcy and risk are made all the more explicit with the widespread commercialization of the sperm bank. The industry didn't really reach its stride until the 1980s, late 1980s, when the emergence of the AIDS epidemic stoked fears about the use of semen and prompted more careful quarantine and screening procedures. Cryobanks started to market themselves not only as the safest option from a health and safety standpoint when it came to assisted reproduction, but also as a less risky option when it came to creating future offspring. Today, the contemporary multi-billion-dollar gamete industry is driven by ideals of health management and risk minimization. These organizations range from the relatively rare nonprofit institutions focused on improving access to safe reproductive services to a wide range of upscale private enterprises. Sperm banks are united by the model of consumer choice. Prospective parents select donor semen on the basis of donor traits and characteristics that are deemed socially and medically desirable. Consumers can search through reams of donor information, narrowing down their selection on the basis of, for example, race, ethnicity, religion, eye color, skin tone, hair color, or texture, but even height, weight, blood type, education level, SAT scores, talents, hobbies, astrological signs, and aspects of general appearance. Virtually all contemporary North American sperm banks offer some kind of screening prior to accepting donations. For example, Xytex requires the donor candidate to provide a personal and family medical history, submit to a personality assessment interview, have a thorough physical exam, and provide semen, blood, and urine samples for preliminary analysis. As contemporary commercialized sperm banks advertise themselves by and derive profit from the perceived caliber of their donors and the quality of their sperm products, these screening processes are governed by health and safety regulations as well as by sociocultural norms. And so despite the seemingly boundless field of choice when it comes to donor selection, there are nonetheless very clear limits placed on the range of possible choices to be made by prospective parents. Many donor traits, both heritable and not, remain essentially unchoosable for consumers. For example, men under 5'8" are kind of full stop rejected by most sperm banks, and many don't accept semen from gay men. The sperm bank thus braids together eugenic ideals of human genetics and biology with capitalist understandings of choice, investment, and futurity. relying on oversimplified and deterministic cultural understandings of human genetics and heredity. The overarching narrative underpinning commercial sperm banks is one of genetic destiny, promising to give prospective parents a hand in choosing the identity and potential of their future offspring. Yet, as we've seen, many of the traits and characteristics that are being selected for, such as education level or SAT scores, are not genetically heritable. What is more, as recent developments in the science of genetics suggest, even traits and conditions that are widely understood to be genetically linked, such as schizophrenia, for example, are nonetheless profoundly social.
So much of the outrage surrounding the case of donor 9623 hinges on the idea that schizophrenia is heritable, that the highly stigmatized disorder is written into the DNA code and can be transmitted from one generation to the next. Upon learning that their son's sperm donor was previously diagnosed with schizophrenia, parents Collins and Hansen were confronted by the possibility that their son too might harbor a genetic predisposition to the disorder. And yet the genetics of schizophrenia remains wildly heterogeneous. That is, no single schizophrenia gene accounts for all cases where the disorder is diagnosed. Due to this genetic complexity, there is currently no objective laboratory method or technology that can be used to confirm a clinical diagnosis of schizophrenia. For an increasing number of researchers and clinicians, the categorical concept of schizophrenia is an inappropriate one, as a singular domain cannot encapsulate a remarkably diverse range of human genetic and phenotypic variability. Many in the field are thus advocating for a more dimensional framework of diagnosis. Under this approach, the clinician is trained to observe, measure, and monitor for the disorder by degree. According to the American Psychiatric Association, with this approach, quote, normalcy and pathology are no longer imagined to be diametrically opposed and mutually exclusive, but are reconfigured instead as oppositional poles anchoring a graded spectrum of diagnostic possibilities, end quote. Perhaps the clearest evidence of the shifting grounds of psychiatry lies in the most recent revision of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM-5. In select diagnostic categories, the DSM-5 has added new dimensional scales that measure things like symptom severity, affect intensity, and the state of functionality. With schizophrenia, the DSM-5 eliminates the discrete disorder subtypes, replacing these with a single wide-reaching schizophrenia spectrum. The new integrated diagnostic category is comprised of a sliding 5-point metric measuring symptom severity. The scale includes 9 domains that can be rated for their level of severity, and a score of 2 or higher is taken as a diagnostic indicator for the disorder. Just as this new schizophrenia severity scale places the signs and symptoms of psychosis on a continuum with normal mental states, it also and at the same time works to secure a more specific quantified means of differentiation between mental states. While spectral adjustments to the diagnostic category of schizophrenia blur the boundary between threshold and subthreshold symptoms, making it more possible for clinicians to observe what they call the earliest developmental stages of schizophrenia, the severity metric provides a modality for the flexible ordering and management of states of health and pathology, states which remain unambiguously oppositional and morally determined. We must then confront spectral risk as a key contemporary site of both freedom and control. Operating in a mode that is at once anticipatory and regulatory, the contemporary spectralization of risk instantiates a sense of personal freedom through a uniquely neoliberal consolidation of eugenic control.
The case of donor 9623 helps us to attend to the haunting interrelations connecting disability with spectral notions of health and risk. as well as to practices of ongoing personalized risk management and therapeutics. As a result of Agelu's genetic material, Collins and Hansen maintain that their son may face, quote unquote, a debilitating lifestyle, and that this potentiality is best responded to by continuous medical monitoring and, where appropriate, early intervention so as to deter the onset of mental illness. In an interview with the CBC, Collins discusses how a medical monitoring fund, one of the key demands made in the Xytex lawsuit, might better enable families to take back some measure of control over their children's genetic inheritance. The fund, says Collins, would help families of children showing early symptoms of mental illness, but would also enable families with non-symptomatic children to be proactive in staving off the onset of illness. Collins asks, are there things that we could be doing preventatively? So having our kids enrolled in certain kinds of programming, do we need particular kinds of parental advice or workshops to go to, learning all that we can about mental health issues? Anything that can possibly allow us to set our kids up for the best life possible, given the circumstances, end quote. As more and more medical risks are identified, from environmental exposures to susceptible gene regions, and with significant technological advances contributing to an increased capacity to assess and monitor for potential risk factors, Peter Conrad notes that risk is, quote, increasingly treated as if it were an illness in and of itself, where risk factors are themselves seen as proto-disease, end quote. This sensibility of the body as inherently disordered obscures the relationality of both risk and responsibility, and has given rise to a culture in which health itself is not only conceived of as a duty, but as a form of risk reduction or prevention. Categorical assessments and static diagnoses are now giving way to a calculation of normalcy and pathology by degree, medical monitoring, probability assessments, severity metrics, and risk management, measuring and anticipating the gradations of a disability or illness that is or could yet be. And as both disease and disease risk are interpreted through a spectrum of probabilities and severities that are tied to a person's history, exposures, and experiences, practices of risk surveillance and management move outside of the traditional biomedical institutions and relations, such as hospitals, clinics, doctor-patient interactions, and extend to all facets of human vitality.
The idea that Collins and Hansen's son might be biologically determined flies in the face of genetic understandings of disability and mental health, and even the DSM-5's own rewriting of the categories of schizophrenia as a wide-reaching dimensional schizophrenia spectrum. His risk, nonetheless, continues to be hailed and reproduced through forms of individualized medicalization, in this case through calls for the continuous surveillance of the individual, his behaviors, reactions, emotions, choices, the programs he's enrolled in, the people he spends time with, and so on, rather than through enacting substantive alterations to our collective social, political, economic, environmental, and cultural living conditions. The science of plastic brains, flexible epigenomes, and dimensional psychiatry might well open up tremendous possibilities for improved medical treatments. At the same time, such discoveries are driving and are being driven by the interests of a variety of private industries and attendant neoliberal demands for innovation and adaptation, demands that dictate that individuals must optimize and enhance their biology as a matter of personal responsibility and citizenship. By investing in spectrums of risk and personalized mental health care, we are offered the hope that our genetic futures, previously thought to be indelible, might yet be overwritten by responsible behaviors and good choices. Indeed, through preventative and therapeutic enhancements, ongoing surveillance and assessment, and where necessary, early rehabilitative interventions, the hope and indeed the expectation is that we are able to choose to transform our brains and bodies away from disability. This kind of mental health spectrum produces normalizing subject effects. Haunted by the looming specter of new or more severe forms of disability, which are always on the horizon, the 21st century spectral subject is required to be alert to and to guard against its object of dread by choosing to invest in ongoing bodily and mental interventions, therapeutic protocols, and surveillance regimens. We read this as a form of compulsory able-bodied and mindedness or compulsory non-disability, a normalizing system which, according to Robert McClure, quote, functions by covering over with the appearance of choice, a system in which there is actually no choice, end quote. For just as it is virtually impossible to choose some donor characteristics at the sperm bank, in an era in which ongoing personalized medical surveillance regimens and therapeutic and enhancement technologies proliferate, it is also becoming increasingly difficult to choose certain kinds of non-normative bodies or minds by, for example, opting out of normalizing interventions or treatments. Of course, the idea of choice also presumes that everyone is equally positioned to opt in the first place. As the Zytec lawsuit makes clear, ongoing personalized medical surveillance and intervention is costly, often privatized, and thus accessible only to those few with the necessary private resources and networks. This leaves the vast majority of existing disabled people, as well as people belonging to this expansive and nebulous group of the not quite or not yet disabled, in the impossible position of being unable to choose the only available choice. To find oneself occupying a space that is culturally and politically unanticipated, undesired, and/or forbidden is most certainly to find oneself exposed to yet another range of risks to the flourishing of body and mind, risks that are often socially and politically sanctioned under the structural conditions of compulsory able-bodiedness and its intersections, such as increased rates of incarceration and institutionalization, police and state surveillance, violence, poverty, suicide, social isolation, and so on. This context is important to think through as we endeavor to make room for more capacious understandings of disability and risk, understandings that we hope might haunt us toward being more attentive to the uneven social, political, and environmental conditions that mediate disability risk, such as the disability to come, while also, and at the same time, push us to fight for the just treatment of what Liat Ben Moshe phrases as the disability already here.
Towards a broken politics for a disabled world, it says on the slide. And there's this spider web that has been repaired with stitching, and I'm missing the artist right now, but I'll put it in the chat box after. Spectrums of risk and attempts to control, optimize, or intervene in our body minds highlights the ways in which we are haunted by disability. Disability remains an object of dread precisely because we can never fully overcome it. Nor can we, it seems, fully embrace it. Disability does not lurk in individual bodies, but rather it circulates in and out of our bodies, both of us and beyond us. The circulation of disability and disability risk is itself a political relation. Disability is an effect of structural and/or interpersonal violence, oppression, exposures, and traumas. And this ensures that disability is distributed unevenly across populations. And in some cases, such debilitation is politically targeted. The possibility of the spectrum of disability lies in the ways it exposes an inherent connectivity, a relationality and interdependency between bodies and their social and physical environments. Indeed, this notion of a relational and responsive disability spectrum promises that we can together make a world that can embrace variegations of embodied difference, such that confronting the biosocial limits of ourselves is met with collective commitments to creating infrastructures of access, care, and supports for flourishing. Yet a haunting dread of disability, entangled with forms of compulsory able-bodied and able-mindedness, continues to successfully dominate contemporary discourses and practices of the body. This system of control is able to operate precisely because of the ways in which disability is embroiled with targeted forms of debilitation and capacitation. The individualized embrace of spectral risk, the desire to control and shield oneself through enhancement, optimization, and early intervention, all of this threatens to weaponize disability against itself. Put differently, instead of moving toward a more expansive take-up of disability justice, we continue to hail the disability spectrum as a vector of social control, a weapon of debilitation, a tool of eugenics, white supremacy, and nationalism, and as a way of upholding oppressive social, political, economic, and environmental conditions. These practices work to turn the promise of disability, disability's spectrality, its relationality, into a means of limiting or even foreclosing possibilities for flourishing in and with disability. As long as disability remains an untenable way of being, disability will not only continue to haunt us as an object of dread, but will also be selectively weaponized against us to support the targeted debilitation of particular and often already marginalized populations. For the ghost of disability to move on, for being fine right now to be transformed into also being fine with the disability to come, we need to disconnect disability from such bio and necropolitical weaponized practices of debilitation and capacitation, and embrace, support, and engage with what crip culture and disability justice social movements offer us. As we've seen, the case of donor 9623 doesn't end with biological determinism. This isn't the story of risk realized, but rather it dwells in spectral risk, speculative futures, ongoing monitoring, and perpetual therapeutic controls. And as we learn more about the interdependency of our genetic code, the fluidity of our inheritances, and the dimensionality of our minds, as we experience and study the interdependencies between the molecules that compose us and the environments that contain us, we're confronted with the contingencies and multiplicities of a human biology with complex genealogies. Because of this, we need to learn to live with embodied differences. We must do this, moreover, not as an alibi for maintaining the normative order of things through the management of it and profiteering from non-normative bodies and minds. Instead, we need to parse out how it is that risky lives are livable, while still attending to the uneven ways in which systems of white supremacy, anti-Black racism, settler colonialism, carceral capitalism, and liberal inclusionism produces debilitation and disability. Disability is not something we have, but a set of social relations we participate in. In this way, we vitally need disability pride, disability arts and culture, crip epistemologies, and crip technoscience. And we need these things as much as we need access, healthcare, housing, and employment, for these are the means by which we can live with disability. These are, in other words, the specific practices, sensibilities, and discourses that imbue disability not only with possibility, but with transformative meaning, value, and desirability. Embracing disability and disability culture enables us to offer both the disability to come and the disability that's already here, something more than dread, monitoring, intervention, and individual overcoming.
In our book project, we draw on decades of crip theory scholarship, politics, and activism to explore and engage with the generative possibilities of crip knowledge practices of care, repair, retrofitting, and maintenance to attend to the risk we collectively, though unevenly, inhabit and face. We consider how these knowledge practices might better enable us to grapple with the risky, broken social conditions under which we live and live differently, and move towards more accessible futures in which disabled people thrive. We ask, in what novel ways can crip theory engage with how breakdown, as anthropologist Shannon Matten has termed it, has become our epistemic and experiential reality? These days, we are inundated with socio-political calls to fix that which has been broken. And these days, there is no doubt that so much is broken. Broken immigration, education, and healthcare systems, broken infrastructure, broken treaties, broken bodies, and broken public trust. However, too often these calls to fix the broken lean on spectrums of individualized risk. To fix the broken, in other words, we are told we must better assess and monitor for risk, mitigate this risk, manage it, or else better innovate this risk, harness it into an opportunity. Such frameworks of risk and risk management do not permit us to critically question what exactly requires fixing in the first place. As one of our students in a disability studies seminar said, quote, "I don't want to repair a broken colonial system. I want something other, something better," end quote. We agree with this desire for something better. We also have to hold it in tension with a dominant and powerful settler logic that continues to benefit from the refusal to repair broken colonial systems. Still, as notes Carleton's own social theorist, Alexis Shotwell, quote, "All there is the possibility of acting from where we are. We are compromised," she reminds us, "and we have made compromises. And this will continue to be the way we craft the worlds to come, whatever they might turn out to be. Since it is not possible to avoid complicity," Shotwell continues, "we do better to start from an assumption that everyone is implicated in situations we, at least in some way, repudiate," end quote. What we take from this is that how we think about repairing the broken does not have to mean a rebuilding of the same. Repair can be a practice of our abolitionary imagination to build the world we want. It is through engaging with the bigger picture of relational issues and histories where we can better orient to the kinds of solutions and innovations that might bring us to someplace better, what Ruha Benjamin calls informed refusals, which combine a critique of what is with a vision of what can and should be. In training our focus on the broken as a discrete, tragic problem in need of an individualized fix, the profound sociality of the tragedy of our contemporary times is distorted. This, in turn, limits our means of response. What we see in our case study is how the individualization of risk works to displace the sociality and kin relations of our shared disabled world in favor of cure, overcoming, and eugenic elimination. This sidelines the disruptive and transformative promise of disability. We seek to develop a broken politics for a disabled world, borrowing from the maintenance and care knowledge practices of disability activism and culture, crip theory, and building on experiences of living on with disability and within disability communities. We seek to engage, in other words, maintenance and repair practices in ways that resist siloing broken as a tragedy in need of fix, rather approaching disability, risk, and the broken through accountable and transformative relations of care, kinship, mutual aid, and access. A broken world is a disabled world, and embracing a broken politics for a disabled world is not to ignore or gloss over suffering, ableism, or other social, ecological, political, or economic injustices. So much of the work of critical disability studies is in the service of building community so that disabled people are not isolated and do not struggle alone. And such community building is full of friction. Our project seeks to engage with these frictions and to mobilize transformative CRIP knowledge practices that push for more accessible futures. Vis-a-vis the brokenness of our contemporary social, political, and economic infrastructures and relations, we need to move towards non-individualizing notions of bodily and mental variation and embrace the relationality of our risk. Rather than individualizing risk, measuring it, monitoring it, plotting it on a continuum, risk spectrums might instead invite us towards a better understanding of how we are implicated in each other's flourishing. The spectral turn we are envisioning here is not a repetition, in other words, of such familiar erasures as "we're all the same but different." To the contrary, a focus on how our variations connect us and on how risk is shared requires careful and sustained attention to our positionality relative to others, including non-human others. In these ways, the spectral could provide a useful foundation from which to robustly address environmental and structural inequities, foregrounding new possibilities for solidarity and coalition between and across differently affected marginalized groups. Thank you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Kellyanne Ann. Oh, sorry. Yeah, everyone, the little emoticons are coming up for the thank you, everyone. Visually applaud. I was muted while I did mine. I'm going to open the floor first. I won't hog questions. Does anyone, would anyone like to start us off with a question? Oh, I will just say, sorry, at the outset, we muted everyone at the beginning, so if you would like to ask a question, you've got to unmute yourself at the bottom left of your screen first. We have one in the chat from Miranda Brady, which I will, if we could, we'll start with that one, but I'll read it out so that it's auditorially referenced. I'm wondering, she said, this is an excellent talk, and I'm wondering whether internalization of risk also relates to the atomization of care under the current capitalist system. In treating children as property, as Sophie Lewis discusses, we also treat their care as individual, and the idea of risk is intensified when care is managed individually rather than spread out socially, leading to the dread you mentioned. Thank you for that question, Miranda.
I'm just going to jump in. I absolutely think that we can see a very acute manifestation of the spectrum of risk as it plays out in relation to children and childhoods, and this notion of potentiality, because the figure of the child is par excellence this kind of unrealized potential, or it's treated as such in discourses that are very specifically individualized around risk and childhood and future. And so, yeah, I mean, I would agree with Miranda's comment. It's something that I've noted in my other work, which looks specifically at autism and how the ways in which risk discourse plays out in relation to kind of a potential for not only for having an autistic child, but also for what kind of future is possible in relation to that autistic child, dependent on these ideas of ongoing monitoring, perpetual therapy, and so on. And so, yeah, I think it's absolutely related.
Yeah, I think too, this question of property is one that we explore in our larger work, like thinking about how normatively disability is understood as a property of individual bodies that we can control. It sort of extends to how we think about other parts of the world. And so one of the things that we're doing is trying to think expansively about, broken environments as being disabled. And so thinking about those non-human relations in relation to how we understand what disability is and can be. And so that changes how we understand what it means to care for the broken, and what responsibility we have to these different facets of brokenness that, we sort of hope will destroy some of these focuses on property.
Thank you. Other Anne has a question. Would you like to ask orally?
Am I
there you are. Yes.
Hi. Thank you for a wonderful talk. So much to think about, and my head is now spinning with the repair maintenance nexus. But I wanted to go back to what I thought was such an exciting convergence of the specter and the spectrum in the initial phases of the talk, partly because I want to hear you talk more about what it means to put them together. I'll just say I'm someone who loves specters and hates spectrums. I mean, I'm speaking very extremely, but I would love to hear you comment further. For example, on that slide you showed that was the different spectrums for schizophrenia, because I think often those pretend to be undoing binaries, but they simply reinstall them by other means. At the same time, I think spectrums and continuums get used in a variety of ways, both clinical or quantitative and qualitative. So I'm thinking, I'd love to hear you talk about the intersection of the spectrum as used within medical and diagnostic contexts and the spectrum used in gender and sexuality context, like going back to the lesbian continuum to get really old school, but also even terms like masculine of center or feminine of center are quite common colloquially and are doing, I think, a good kind of work in challenging gender norms and giving us gender non-binaries. But I think they can also have their limits. So just wondering what it means then to approach the question of the spectrum as you've been doing it, just more on your thinking with regard to that category. And then how is it really blown open? Because I think it is, by linking it up with this notion of the spectrum. Where sometimes I've just been reading a lot of Black feminism, so the way in which haunting and ghosts and so on are actually a way of making certain things present that are otherwise off people's radar. So in that sense, like, haunting is a good way to, some cases, undo settler colonialism or do justice to the afterlife of slavery. So it has those resonances for me as well, the question of the specter. Thanks. It was just a lot to think with.
Thanks, Anne. I think those are actually really great examples. So one of the things that we wanted to do in doing this talk is to start compiling more of an archive of the ways in which spectrum is used and its relation to haunting. And so I think gender and sexuality is absolutely like a really important area to think through in terms of what are the relations between disability and gender and sexuality, and how spectrum is being mobilized both sort of in the realm of activism and politics, but then also through medicalization. And so I think attending to some of those, there's probably a number of like very interesting case studies that could come out of that work. Anne?
Yeah, I was thinking too, in relation, like in terms of building this archive of the ways in which spectrum is mobilized in discussions and critiques of colorism as well, in kind of a resonant way. when we're thinking about kind of the ways in which spectrum is medicalized, and you really saw this in the schizophrenia spectrum, and I've written elsewhere about the autism spectrum in the DSM-5 as well. And just to kind of go to that one, just because I think it's such a fruitful example. In the ways in which autism as a category changed in the DSM-5, it went from being kind of individual sub-diagnoses to being kind of a more expansive spectrum at the same time as the severity metrics were introduced to kind of create a situation where autistic people were kind of pathologized by degree. But what was I found super interesting about this autism severity metric is that it both kind of focuses on individual pathology and degrees of pathology and severity at the same time as the metric itself says it's measuring degree of functionality, which is a profoundly social cultural phenomenon. We are functional in a given environment only because of the environmental supports that are in place for us. We inhabit functionality dependent on the environment in which we find ourselves. But at the same time, this metric kind of turns back to an individualizing process where an autistic person might be labeled as a level 1, a level 2, a level 3, and so I think there's a missed opportunity there to kind of probe at the ways in which the spectrum points us to thinking about the individual in their environment and the relationship between the two.
Thank you.
I should have introduced at the beginning for our diverse, not all from certainly Carleton viewers, that Professor Ann Ketkiewicz is the director of the Pauline Jewett Institute for Women and Gender Studies here at Carleton. And actually going forward, if I could ask people when you do ask a question, to however you want to represent yourself, give a little introduction first so that everyone else knows the community here. I'd like to pass next to Professor Dominique Marshall. You don't have to ask in the question section, but some people have, so I'll go to everyone who has, and then people can just. Professor Dominique Marshall has a question.
Hey, hi, I'm a historian, and I'm going to do a historian remark and question. So there's 3 ways. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful talk. There is 3 ways where history enters what you're talking about, I was thinking about. First of all, there's the history of your cases, even more deeper, like the history of that company and how that they've been licensed and everything. Then there's the history of precedents, and I'll name 3 that I thought about. Adoption and fostering, where parents can choose and actually send back their children. Then there is the whole business of the actuarial methods and private insurance, and how these private insurance people like Richard Titmuss in the UK were helped to put together the social insurance mechanism with all the same actuarial methods, and where the question of risk, collective and individual risk, was discussed all the time, and the division between private and public logics was really not that clear. And finally, the whole tradition of mutual and cooperative insurance that has also a very rich history. So my third historical thing about the history, before the history of your case and then the history of precedents, is the history of forgotten alternatives or lost and retrieved memories. So this is my question. In all what you've looked at, you're talking about future, better ways of looking at things. You probably have noted some alternatives that were not taken, that where the past constitute a rich bank of possibilities. And I was thinking maybe you could mention 1 or 2. Thank you.
I think that's definitely true. I can't say that any examples come immediately to mind for me in what we were looking at.
I mean, thinking about the broken and, the kind of everyday ways or neoliberal ways we orient to broken is to try and fix it, to innovate it, to create a set of solutions that will patch up the broken so that the broken remains the same, or the institution or the set of structures remains the same. And one of the kind of insights that we got from, that we've kind of been drawing from disability activism and disability scholarship and memoir has been kind of this idea that, disability has so often been linked as a state of brokenness. And disability scholars and activists have really kind of shown us the ways in which that we can orient to broken not as something that is in need of fix, or we can kind of enact these processes of repair in such a way that doesn't rebuild the same. And where was I going with this? So the history of lost or retrieved memories. One of the kind of fruitful areas that we've been thinking with is how our disability mutual aid practices, which have been, going on for forever in many different ways, hacks and different ways of creating stopgaps in impossible situations. How are those kind of processes ways of that we can name and think of as political practices for orienting toward building something else?
Okay. Susan Antebby has a question.
Great. Hi. Yeah, I'm Susan Antebby from the University of Toronto, also a colleague of Anne McGuire's there. And thank you, Kelly and Anne, for a great talk. It is excellent work and really got me thinking about these questions of futurity and risk and in really complicated ways. So my question, I guess, is also partly historical. And I'm thinking about, as you were talking about this notion of risk, and I think you were citing Peter Conrad, where he says that it's sometimes treated as if it were an illness in and of itself, right? It seems like a really interesting and complicated temporal formation. And I was thinking about sort of work that's been done on epigenetics and how that might relate to the notion of risk management that you're talking about. And I guess it's a historical question in the sense that I'm also wondering, since epigenetics in a way is, it has this sort of scientific current day research that's being done on it, but it's also sometimes configured as a throwback to earlier genetic ways of thinking about risk, right? The idea that the germplasm or genes could somehow change depending on how individuals behaved in their lives and thus influence future generations. So I guess, my question is, in part, sort of how do you see kind of the thinking and the rebirth or this rekindled interest in epigenetics as part of this management of futurity and risk that you're talking about? And then, to what extent can we situate it historically, right, in relation to these earlier ways of thinking about risk? So then I was also thinking that the idea of the spectrum, which is so strong and prevalent in these surveys and statistics, I'm wondering sort of if that can also be located in an earlier sense, right? Even like the earlier 20th century rise of strong interest in statistics as these mathematical models of something that can't really be pinned down in a very rigorous way.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, in one of the other chapters that we're working on for this project, we are tracing out the history of normalcy in relation to the spectrum and the spectral. So that history is definitely part of what we're trying to do. I think in terms of epigenetics, I think people really want epigenetics to solve our problems, but really from a medicalized perspective. So while epigenetics provides this amazing opportunity to really look at risk as structural and look at ourselves in relation to our environments and our communities and our histories, the histories of trauma and oppression that we embody differentially. I think a lot of the hope is that then we can just solve those problems through further scientific innovation as opposed to attending to those larger environments. So I think our work is trying to push in the opposite direction. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
What you said, yeah.
Laura Horak has a question.
Hi, for folks who don't know me, I'm Laura. I'm in film studies at Carleton. Thank you both for this great talk. And I apologize in advance for being the one who brings up COVID, but I couldn't help but think as I heard your talk, which I know you've been conceptualizing for a while, how many resonances I saw between the discourses of COVID that we're all, experiencing now around risk, individual risk factors, high blood pressure, also obviously social, kind of racist systems, who has what kind of job, who has what kinds of conditions because of what kinds of environments. So this whole question of the risk of catching COVID, and then also the experience of COVID being a kind of spectrum from like totally asymptomatic to long haulers to death, so like, if you take those kind of models of thinking that you were talking about from this particular case study, like what might they say to this other case study of like how we're conceptualizing COVID these days?
One of the things I've kind of been thinking about has been, and Kelly and I have been talking about this as well, is this kind of the kind of opposition that's being built between different kinds of risk or different kinds of risky or communities at risk in the context of COVID. And I'm thinking in particular in relation to mental health. So on the one hand, you have kind of a group of people who are physically more vulnerable to COVID. People with pre-existing health conditions, people who are older, people who are sick or disabled in various ways. On the other hand, you have a group of people who are disproportionately more at risk of mental health issues under lockdown, in context of COVID. Which are, obviously profoundly social as well. And so we're seeing kind of this this like opposition between these groups. And I know like people like Donald Trump have leveraged kind of like, we need to focus on the mental health of this group of people who are experiencing higher rates of depression and anxiety and suicide under lockdown in order to open up economies and then therefore render the other group more vulnerable to the risk of COVID. And so, it's kind of like this question of whose risk is more severe. And that's a question I would really like to kind of pursue a little bit more in a way that kind of doesn't end up with one group being pitted against the other, where one group's risk is more intense or more in need of response over and against the other, but rather finding these opportunities for solidarity and coalition between at-risk groups. And I think kind of the spectrum gives us that possibility as well.
I also think there's a way in which the spectrum isn't actually being taken up at all. Like, COVID has, despite being the new normal and the sort of sense that we've displaced our previous normal relations, things actually haven't changed much at all. Like, we still have higher death rates in institutions and long-term care. Elderly populations are not receiving the kind of due diligence that they deserve. And so I think there's a way in which there's actually been a re-entrenchment of so many inequities that existed in society in ways that, this idea of people experiencing COVID on a spectrum is still only serving those that capitalist, colonial relations were already serving.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's this difference between kind of the physical risk of contracting COVID or becoming ill with COVID or dying of COVID versus mental risk. So you're also seeing kind of, I was reading an article that was talking about the emergence of the COVID stress scales, and a new severity metric that is aimed to kind of help clinicians ascertain different risk factors for folks who are experiencing mental distress in COVID times. And so, I really see that the mental health field is kind of the focal point for these spectral configurations. Whereas, as Kelly's saying, the risk of contracting COVID, of dying of COVID, is actually kind of very stark, and normalized among particular populations who are more vulnerable.
Yeah, but I think too, like the way in which mental health, the mental health industry is really trying to capitalize on this moment, right? Mm-hmm. Like this is the moment where, you should be thinking about your well-being and how you can be a better version of yourself in this really crappy situation. So, mm-hmm. baking bread and making crafts with your kids and doing all this innovative crap, like it's total garbage, because it's not actually dealing with any of the structural factors that are making people miserable, and people should be miserable. It's a miserable moment, but I think we're barking up the wrong tree, so to speak.
We have Alexis Shotwell has a question.
Hi. Thank you for this talk. So I'm Alexis. I teach in the sociology department at Carleton. So, one thing I was thinking about the case of donor 9623 and sort of what the plaintiffs are asking for. So, like, obviously, share all of the critiques that you two have made. They're great. And also, I'm teaching right now from Dean Spade's new mutual aid book, and so, like, yesterday we were reading a little bit of Chris Dixon's book on another politics, and both of them are talking about what gets called a dual power or a counter power strategy, where basically you build the institutions so that people don't have to rely on the existing institutions that are hurting us, like the state. And listening to your talk, it was striking me that quite a lot of that kind of approach. So, for example, when people in Brooklyn built a way for young women, mostly who were being harassed, to have collective community response to that through Sister to Sister, which doesn't exist anymore, but did, there's lots of examples that I'm sure you all can think of. Care collectives, mutual aid work often is about making a case for a future in which you can live. And so part of what they're asking for when they're asking, so like, yes, they're framing it as like continual medical modeling, but like part of what they're asking for is like, we want resources so that if our kid has a hard time, we notice it and we know what we're supposed to do. And definitely they're asking for that in the framework that's offered, which is shitty and destructive and ableist. So I guess I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the infrastructure of futures worth living, right? Does that make sense as a question? Dual power strategies for mutual aid and disability justice. That's what I want.
Yeah, I think, I think you're already saying this, but like the parents are not turning to the disability community and asking, how can we ensure that my son has a future worth living? Not turning to communities of people who have experience with schizophrenia to say, like, what has worked for you? What have been your challenges? How can we support you so that this community can also support my son if he needs it? I think that the immediate turn to a lawsuit to hold a corporation responsible is definitely a strategy, but it comes at the risk of completely turning your back on people who have this lived experience and have lots of things to say about what would make their futures better. Um,
I'm thinking also of the situation or a situation of living with a haunting, living with disability as dread, as itself a risk that is not being grappled with in the context of the lawsuit or the medical monitoring fund, meaning like that child growing up in relation to that ever-present haunting or dread that's of a disability on the horizon, in and of itself it introduces risk that isn't accounted for, that is specific to that individual, but also much, much bigger than that individual.
Yeah, like I guess it's a question of like what is the most just way in which counterpower can be formed and practiced, and I don't see it happening through lawsuits.
Well, no, because lawsuits are problem closure technologies, right? Like they rely on past precedent in complicated ways. And so like part of, and obviously you're getting at this in the paper, and I'm sure it'll get more in the book, that the entire apparatus of the sperm bank is a eugenicist technology. And if we're going to talk about like creating reproductive justice, part of it would be having like widely and easily available, but it's complicated, right? Like I was about to say, widely and easily available reproductive facilitation access, right? So that, there is tons of free sperm kicking around, but you have to engage with various things. And if you decide not to go that way, you're in this, like picking what parent you want as a sperm giver. So it's like, I feel like the dual power approach has to be something that would allow us to talk about, if we're going to reproduce, what are the conditions under which that's happening, in such a way that you're making choices, knowing that there's something to come that holds all of us, right? Anyway, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I have a question. You brought up, and I mean your work in general, applying feminist and anti-racist frameworks or just arguments to disability, and I can only imagine if a sperm bank did not. I mean, a sperm bank does facilitate racial eugenics, of course, by just letting you pick the race. But if a sperm bank did not accept donations from Black people because it would increase the risk that a child might be on a spectrum of Blackness, like coldly stated like that, I have to imagine there would be some lawsuits, not that it would stop them. Have you encountered, do you know if there have been legal attacks? In Canada, it would be the argument that it goes against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It would different anti-racist, or not specifically anti-racist, but anti-discriminatory, anti-disability laws in other countries. Is that argument being made? I mean, you're making that argument kind of, but is that taking the suing and putting it the other way? I'm saying, has anyone actually mounted legal challenges against the very concept of not accepting Down syndrome donors or something like that?
Not that I know of. There's definitely been cases where there's been lawsuits where people where white people have had a Black child as a result of not getting the right sperm inseminated. And so in those cases, it was a wrongful birth suit in the United States, where white parents were claiming that they would not have chosen to have a Black child, and that this child is going to face discrimination in their future. And so they need to receive financial compensation for this wrongful birth. But I'm not aware of any cases going in the opposite direction, where people are demanding sperm banks allow them to have disabled children or.
I'm thinking of the case of what else? Alison Kafer writes about the case of the deaf lesbians, which she refers to them, and where a couple in the U.S. And I'm maybe getting the details. It's been a while, but a couple in the U.S., a lesbian couple, deaf lesbian couple wanted to have a child who was deaf, and sought to access sperm from a deaf donor. Initially through the database, it wasn't available, and then they actually brought on found a donor independently, but we're still running into difficulty getting having a doctor sign off on insemination process and artificial insemination process. And so again, like it goes back to this like unchoosable thing that we were talking about in our talk. There are some futures that are unchoosable, in not just in the sperm bank, but in the kind of wider reproductive industry.
Right.
Thanks, Anne. Good memory.
Like it seems reminiscent of the same-sex ban of donating blood. Like of understandably, a lot of people are not going to seek to choose disability in the same way that people are not going to want AIDS. But this is the problem with risk spectrum, is you're then just taking an entire group of people, defining them as, I mean, you've said it, obviously, I'm just repeating it, defining them as, because they're at risk, they're completely excluded. And if you did it with anything but disability, I feel like it would get challenged more. But that's the issue with risk. I suppose race isn't a risk. It's a different kind of risk. Okay, sorry. It's an angering and complicated concept. Does anyone else have any questions?
I have a mini one, which is, could Kelly and Anne very quickly, because we're almost finished, tell us about their other cases in their book?
Yeah, so the book opens with a case study around the changing understandings of normalcy and how that relates to the spectrum. And so we're just sort of charting out different cultural examples. Then we have this chapter on risk. After that, we are developing a chapter on climate change in relation to broken infrastructures around our environmental destruction and our not so hopeful futures, and how we think disability politics can speak to those issues. We're also developing a chapter on mental health, looking specifically at U of T's horrible response to all the mental health challenges that have been happening there. We're planning on ending on a case study of hope, but we haven't quite pieced together what that looks like yet.
If anyone has good ideas for a hope case study, send them our way.
Anne is on sabbatical this year, and our hope was that we would be able to intensely write this book. But of course, COVID has derailed those plans. So some of our thinking is a little behind where we thought we would be by now.
I'm hoping my children will be back in school by January so that we can start really writing thinking through the book as a whole.
Well, that seems like an excellent place to end. Looking forward to more work in the future. I'd like to thank everyone. Please join me again in thanking our speakers, Kelly and Anne. And yeah, we hope to have this up on our if anyone has other friends or colleagues who think they might be interested in this, we hope to have it up on the CUDRG YouTube channel within 2 weeks, and we'll soon be launching a new website with all of our previous talks with supplementary information and ways to connect you to the work. So yeah, thank you everybody for attending.
Ryan, can I stop a minute? I would like to thank you and Julia and Chloe, the whole team behind, and Alex, the whole team behind the organization and the recording of this and the posting of this, for a wonderful job, since it's the last lecture.
Thank you very much. And I echo thank you, Julia and Chloe and Brittany for doing a lot of our transcription. Yeah, this is the end of the first run of the series. We'll
Maybe
see.
Julia
Certainly
and Chloe could show themselves so we can actually thank them if they are still around.
There's Chloe. Julia has had to run to class.
Yeah,
Chloe's there and Brittany is somewhere. Hi, Brittany. Okay, so thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll be back. It's certainly a concept that is can keep going. So again, if the once we get the website up, we'll make sure to message all of our friends and affiliates next if we do get a new series up and running. Thank you, Dominique. Thank you, everyone.